Hey everybody, it's Lloyd here, and I'm just stopping by for a few minutes today to talk about a little something that, well, has been on my mind recently due to some reading that I've been doing and some things that I've been listening to recently about negotiations during this coronavirus situation we find ourselves in. So bear with me if you would for just a few minutes. I've got a couple of tips I believe that will help us as we look at this thing called virtual negotiating, uh, not face to face, can be very, very difficult. So I want to run through a few things about technology and give you a few tips about negotiating when you're not able to sit across the table from someone, which is kind of the way we're wired. So let's take a look at a real short PowerPoint here, and I hope it helps you a lot. Virtual negotiation tips for using technology. Let's talk about email for a second. Let me just say this about virtual negotiations using email. If you can avoid it at all, do not negotiate via email. Um, Obviously, there might be a time or two when we need to do that, and I'm going to give you some tips for how to do that. But there are some reasons for not using email. I just want to cover a couple of those with you real quickly here today. Um, let's take a look at why. Words, either spoken or especially written, only account for about 10% of our communication. Tone accounts for another 30%. That's something words can't convey, is that tone. Well, some people use the all caps in an attempt to be forceful, but I wouldn't necessarily think that's a great idea for using caps for tone. Uh, Tone accounts for 30%. Take a look at body language and visuals. They make up the remaining 60% of our communication skill set. 60%. So words written in an email only account for about 10% of really, really good communication. So if you choose to negotiate by email, 90% of your skill set is being wasted. So I think there are some alternatives, and we're going to take a look at those real quickly. But email negotiating options, maybe Zoom. We're on Zoom right now. I think it's a great program. Skype, Google Hangouts, FaceTime. Even if you can't do that, negotiating with your cell phone at least gives you the opportunity to not only say the words, but the recipient of that phone call, the other person in negotiations, can actually hear the tone in your voice, even though they can't see the body language or any visuals, which I think are pretty important. So if I had an option, I would definitely go with something like Zoom or Skype that we can actually really communicate with somebody, not only with words, but with tone and with body language. But if you can't avoid using email, and there are going to be times when I think we probably won't be able to have an option. I'm going to give you a couple of tips for using email for negotiating. Tip number one, master your language and writing skills. Tone can be very difficult to convey in an email, as we talked. So people have a tendency to interpret things in the most negative light possible. It's a reality. I'm sure you've been there. You're also going to be judged for your spelling and your grammar. They're probably likely to misconstrue any unclear message. They're likely to take offense at something where there was no intention of offense. So how do we avoid the predicament? Well, first of all, I think spell check is a wonderful thing. It's not the end all, it's a wonderful thing. I think something called Grammarly is also really, really important. And it's a tool that I think is underused these days, especially in things like what we're talking about today, negotiating. But spell check and Grammarly at least will ensure that what you write would probably make your English teacher proud. So tip number one. But let's take that a step further. Before you hit that send button, read through your email for tone and clarity. Writers actually call this a sweep. And as I learned this skill, I learned to read through a document looking for only one thing at a time. So for example, the first time you read through an email for negotiating, read it looking for tone. Does it sound the way you really want it to sound? Then read through it again. And this time, read through it looking for clarity. Make sure it's very clear. Then again, read through the document for spelling and again for grammar before you push the send button. You're likely to find a few things that you'll change along the way. It's a great tip, tip number one. Tip number two, make it look good. Think about it. When you open an email and it looks like a wall of gray text, you know, I'm guilty of this, I will admit. It looks like a wall of gray text. As far as the eye can see, two things can happen. Number one, if you know it's something important and you absolutely have to read it, your heart kind of sinks a little bit, your shoulders tighten up, and you reluctantly start reading what feels like an assignment. Or, number two, you simply and quickly close the email and move on to the next. You may not even read the document. That really could be very important. So what's the moral here? So the moral is when negotiating by email, keep your message short. There's a 5-1 rule in writing an email that I kind of need to remember myself. But restrain your email to no more than 5 sentences and keep it focused on one topic. Now, again, we're talking most specifically here about negotiating. So 5-1, 5 sentences, keep it focused on one topic. Tip number 3, manage anxiety. You don't have any anxiety right now, do you? I think we probably all have a little bit of anxiety, but when we're negotiating, I can tell you my anxiety level typically goes up. And anxiety is, I will call it the ruthless deal killer. You know, we as humans are wired to communicate face to face. A medium like email naturally creates that extra anxiety right from the very start. And you know, the longer it takes for someone to respond to that email, the more anxiety that builds up. And both sides of the negotiation, I think you'll agree that's probably true. Take that a step further. Someone doesn't respond right away. What happens in our brain? Well, we start to fabricate stories about why the other party isn't responding. Most of the time, these stories create far worse circumstances than what's really, really happening. But that's the way we're wired. So what's the solution? So to avoid the anxiety, this is a great tip. Make a quick call, send a quick text to check that they received your email and keep the communication flowing. Whatever you do, do not get adversarial. Don't send an email back to the other person 10 minutes after you send your email in capitals. Why aren't you getting back to me? That's just going to stress everybody out. Not worth it. Manage your anxiety. Tip number 3. Tip number 4, maybe the most important part, you know, manage relationships. How many times have you heard me talk about relationship building in this business? And while you're negotiating, it is certainly no different and maybe even more important. But one of the nicest things about live negotiations is that you can spend a little bit of time beforehand having a personal conversation, maybe about a common interest or some other form of chit chat. That just doesn't work in an email, especially if we're trying to keep that 5-1 rule in place. So what's the solution? Well, before you send that email, how about thinking about starting with a different type of communication? Maybe a quick phone call or a quick FaceTime. It is a perfect way to establish a little rapport, then letting them know that you're about to send them an email. Build a relationship, be personal, tell them what you're about to do, and then do it. And I think you'll find that the response from doing that is much better, lowers the anxiety, and keeps the negotiations moving along. So a couple of conclusions real quick. Negotiations are a different animal when you can't get face-to-face to someone. Very true. Keep in mind, these tips that I'm giving here don't apply to all emails, you're right, but we're specifically talking about emails and negotiating. So remember that as a conclusion. Don't forget to demonstrate one of the most important elements in all of communication, especially right now. It's called empathy. Regardless of how you negotiate, being empathetic, so very critical. I'm going to end today with the Realtor motto. And I've used this in a number of training sessions, not sure how many of you remember it, but at least I'm going to remind you that the Realtor motto is a good thing to keep in mind when you're negotiating, regardless of how you're negotiating. Real simple. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Really good point. Empathy. Yes, it's biblical, by the way, but it's also the Realtor motto. So, in conclusion, I hope you have a great day. I hope you're keeping safe. I hope you're staying sane. And in the meantime, I'm going to just say goodbye, and I'll see you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.